Hello, my name's Maria Whatton and I'm a storyteller. Welcome, World Storytelling Cafe. There was once an old woman. She had not walked for a day, she had not walked for a week, she had not walked for a month, she had not walked for a year, she had walked her whole life. Wherever she went, she would knock on doors and ask for just something to eat, some water. Time and time again, the door would be slammed shut on her. Sometimes people were reasonably nice. They'd say things like, "Not today, thank you, dear." Sometimes they were downright rude. "Go away." Now the old woman noticed that there was a young man walking about. He had dark hair, a multicoloured cape that swished in the sand as he walked. Wherever he went, whichever door he knocked on, he was always welcomed inside. One day the old woman stopped him and said, "I've been watching you. I've noticed that wherever you go, you're welcomed inside. Who are you?" And the young man said, "I am Story. I'm always welcome." "Who are you?" he said to the old woman. She said, "I'm Truth. Not many people want to know me." "I tell you what," he said, "next time, hide under my cape." And that's what they did. She hid under his cape, they knocked on a door, and they were welcomed inside. And that is why there's always a bit of truth in every story. My grandma told me that story. That was my mum's mum. And my dad told me many stories too. Both of them were from big Irish families. I grew up in Liverpool and I was one of 10 in a family. That was my mum and dad, 8 children. We only had 3 bedrooms. It was a little council house. My mum and dad had 1 bedroom, and you'd think there'd be 4 in each of the other 2 rooms, but you see, there were 7 girls and 1 boy. So my brother had a room all to himself, and 7 of us shared a bedroom. At night, when my mum went to work in the biscuit factory, we'd call my dad up and say, "Dad, tell us a story." My dad worked on building sites all his life. He was a plasterer, and he had, when he came home, white dust in his hair, always white powder on his face, and his overalls would have dried and set, so when he walked, his overalls would crack and creak, and there'd be little puffs of white smoke emitted from his overalls. He looked like a walking statue. Well, he kind of was. He was a sort of monument to stories. He was the one who told us those stories as he stood in the doorway of our bedroom. He'd turn off the light and his voice would come into that bedroom where 7 sisters were lying on 3 bunk beds and a single bed. For me, those words that came into that room lit my imagination. It was like the ceiling crumbled away. It was like the tiles turned into birds and flew off. I would be lying on my top bunk bed, staring at the night sky, glittering with stars. Up there were the Pleiades, 7 sisters, eternally chased by Orion. 7 sisters in the sky, 7 sisters in their beds, listening to their dad telling them stories. Those stories took me through my life. When I went away to university, I'd come back for the holidays and, my aunties and uncles would come round and they'd all be sitting there, with a crate of Mackerson. And if voices began to be raised or people started to sing a little bit too loud, my dad would say, "Let me tell you a story." There was a man. His name was Chronic. He had 2 sons. One was away from home. The other, Connor, lived with him. The year before, old Chronic's wife had died, and now their house was a bit of a mess because they'd relied on Chronic's wife to do everything. "Please, Father," said Connor, "please, can we get someone in to help?" But the old man never seemed to get round to it. One day, Connor came home from working hard in the fields, and he knew as soon as he walked through the door that something was different because it smelt different. It smelt clean. There was a vase of flowers on the table, and there was a delicious smell of stew cooking, and standing there staring at stew was a beautiful woman. She had long dark hair, a waist as slim as a fairy's. When she turned and looked at Connor, her eyes flashed silver. Connor said, "Hello," and she said, "Would you like something to eat?" He said, "Yes, please." And when his father came home, his father sat down next to him, elbowed him and said, "You've done well for yourself here, son." I thought this was the woman you got in to help." "Not me," said old Chronic. "Would you like something to eat?" said the beautiful woman. "Yes, please," said Chronic. And they ate well together that night. They didn't question her. In fact, after they'd finished eating, they all sat by the fire, and the old man gave his son a swift kick. "Isn't it your friends you're going to tonight?" "Not tonight, Father," said Connor. "I think it is." Connor took the hint. Off he went. In fact, he only went over to the barn. He lay down and he fell asleep for a while. When he came back, it was dark, and he sat in the kitchen and he thought he heard horses galloping, and then realised that that noise was coming from upstairs. It was actually the bed legs banging against the ceiling. Upstairs was old Chronic, with his chicken chin and his silvery wiry hair and his bow legs, lying in bed with that beautiful woman. He looked at her. Oh, his heart melted. "Listen," she said, "I am putting a geese upon you. You must never tell anyone that I live here." "Oh, I won't tell anyone as long as you stay," said old Chronic. "Now, what is your name?" And she said, "My name is Macca. Tell no one that I live here, and I will stay with you." Well, the next day they came downstairs. They looked so happy. Connor didn't mind too much because he got very used to the fact that this woman was an excellent cook. There was always a freshly pressed shirt for him to go to work in. And she made everything spick and span. Not only that, but she was as athletic as she was beautiful. One day when one of the stallions broke away and could not be tamed, it was Maca who came out of the house, pulled up her skirts and said to the two men, "Leave it to me." They laughed. They couldn't believe it. The horse was running away. She ran after it. They disappeared over the horizon. "She'll never do it. No, she'll never do it," the two men said. But before long, there she was, riding that horse, now completely tamed and gentle. They could not believe their eyes. Time passed. Cranach and his lovely wife would sit by the fire and they would eat together and they would talk and whisper to each other. Connor noticed that that slim waist was broadening. Maca was with child. He was going to have a little brother or sister. It came to that time of the year when the king celebrated at Lughnasadh, and there were races and there was merriment and festivities. And Cranach said, "Well, I'll be making my way to Lughnasadh tomorrow." Maca said, "Wait, I know what you're like when you have mead on your tongue. You begin to talk, Cranach, and remember I put a geese upon you. Remember what I asked of you." "No woman, no matter how beautiful, will tell me what to do," said the old man, and off he went the next day. The fare was glorious, and he did begin to drink, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 and so on, watching the king's horses race, watching the chariots. He was very happy until he was sitting with the king and all his gods and the druids, great crowds, and all of them were complimenting the king about how wonderful his horses were, how fast they could race, when from the back of the room Cranach said, "Your horses are like old mares. My wife can run faster than any of them." They all looked at him, and the king stared at him and said, "Really? Your wife can outrun my horses? Guards, go and fetch her. Go and bring her to this very place, and we'll see." There was a knock on Maca's door. She opened the door. She was heavy with child. "Your husband's been talking about you," said the guards. "Apparently you're a very good runner. The king wants you to come. Race his horses." "Wait," she said. "Who are you?" "We're the king's guards." "Now, are you coming or not?" "Well, you can see what state I'm in," she said. "Of course not." "Well, in that case, it's your choice. You see, if you don't come, your husband..." Well, Maca, with great dignity, took her shawl, put it around her shoulders, and they tethered her, and they tied her to the back of their chariot, and they dragged her all the way to Lughnasadh. The king looked at her and said, Are you ready then to race my horses? Apparently you're a very fast runner. You can see what state I'm in, she said. Please have some sympathy for me. And she looked around and she saw her husband in the corner of the room. He had sobered up very quickly. His face looked grey. He stared across at her and she at him, and she mouthed to him, "You promised." "I'll race them then," she said, "if it saves my husband's life." And so she lined up with the other stallions and the race began. The horses bolted off, but Macca, well, she just stumbled forward. Everyone began to laugh and point. But her stumbling turned into walking. Her walking turned into running. Her running turned into a gallop. She was now neck and neck with the horses. Her heels kicked up the dirt from the floor, and she surpassed them all. And she won that race, and once she had got to the finishing line, she collapsed in agony. In childbirth. And as she groaned, she called out a curse upon all you men, she said, for 9 generations. If you go into battle, you will become like a woman giving birth. And they could feel it within them right at that moment. They were paralysed, but their bellies writhed in agony. And there, on that very spot, Macca gave birth to twins, a girl and a boy. Evan Macca, that place is called. Macca's twins. So you see, said my dad, that's what happens when you drink too much. Stories. Those stories were always in my mind, always there to help me pass the day. Especially if I was going to visit one of my friends. I used to have to get a couple of buses. I'd stand on Queen's Drive at that bus stop. It seemed like an eternity I was waiting for those buses. But the block of flats across the road looked like a castle to me, because my dad had lit my imagination. And the cars zooming past on Queen's Drive, zoom, 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 became the waves of the sea. Césaire was a mighty woman. She looked up at the sky, and it was an iron fortress. It shifted and grew, and she knew that it was pregnant with death. A flood was coming. One drop of rain fell on her cheek, and she knew she had to act quickly. She ran to the only man who was making an ark. And that man, of course, was, you got it, Noah. Please, she said, I need somewhere for myself and my clan so that we can be saved from this terrible flood that is going to happen. But Noah shook his head. He said, this ark is for all the beasts of the earth and the air to come in pairs, and my clan only. I am sorry, there is no room. Did Césaire give up? No, she did not. She thought, I'll do this myself. She knew she had to find people who had skills to cut down trees, to chop them into planks of wood. She needed engineers to build those vessels that she required. She needed people who were calm, because this was going to be a dangerous journey. She needed people that could survive and had that survival instinct. And you know, she found them. 150 women. They made 3 arks for her. And when the rain began to fall in great sheets, and when a sea rose, those 3 vessels rode the waves for 3 whole years. But in that time, 2 of the arks sank, and there was just 1 left. Césaire was on that ark with 50 women and her husband Fintan and her father and her brother Bith and Ladron. And after 3 years, in the distance, she saw sparkling, glittering, an island. It was like an emerald. It was fringed with mountains. There were great slopes of woodland and deep valleys. It was a fertile land. It was Ireland. And it was Césaire, that mighty woman who was the first person to set foot on that soil. Fintan, Césaire's husband, I think felt quite overwhelmed, because now they had to populate the island. 50 women, 3 men. Fintan saw a mountain crested with a twisted tree, and he began to climb up it across the craggy rocks. And he came to a cave, and he went inside the cave, and he sat on the lip of that cave, his legs dangling. And he looked down at the boiling sea below. And as he was looking down into the sea and meditating, something began to shift and change. His skin began to shimmer. It began to turn silver. And then his arms began to shrink. His fingers welded together and became fins. His whole body changed. His eyes became round and glassy. And his legs, they moulded together and became a fin. His skin was now silver and speckled, and he had turned into a salmon, and he dived down, down, down into the waters below. Down he went to the very bottom, where there was the well of wisdom. Next to that well were the 9 hazelnuts of wisdom, and the salmon ate them all. And he began to swim and swim through those seas. He swam and swam around Ireland for 3,000 years, through the time of the Nemesians, through the time of the Fairbald, the Bagmen, all these invaders, the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians, and the Milesians who came from Spain, to the time of the great kings, when Ireland was broken up into provinces, Ulster in the north, Munster in the south, Leinster in the east, Connacht in the west, and in the centre of Ireland, the High King lived in the castle at Tara. In that castle there was a great king. Well, that king, He had many stories to tell, but he knew that he had to have the whole of his island guarded, and guarded well, by warriors. There were chieftains and there were groups of men called the Fianna. The Fianna were the warriors who would look after Island. Cool was the leader of the Fianna. But when he fell in love with Mwerna, a druid's daughter, when he ran away with her, it was Gol MacMorna who came after him. He wanted Cool's place, you see. And so Mwerna had to go into hiding, and she was ready to give birth to their child. As she gave birth to a baby boy, on the battlefield, her husband, Cool, was killed and took his last breath. She knew Gol MacMorna's man was after her son, and so she did the most difficult thing that a mother can do. She gave him away. She gave him to her two friends, Bolval and Leah Lucra, to take care of him. They took him to the Sleeve Bloom Hills, and there they raised him with love, and they taught him how to become a great warrior, taught him how to hold a spear, taught him how to hunt, taught him how to run fast. When he left that place as a young man, he knew there was one thing he still needed to do. I mean, to be a great warrior, you also need to be a great poet. Good with words, especially if you're going to be a leader. And there was one man who could teach him, and that was Finnegas. Finnegas had spent the last 7 years on the banks of the Boyne fishing. You see, Finnegas wanted to catch the salmon of wisdom. And he'd been waiting patiently when this young fella turns up and says, "Can you be my master? Can you teach me how to write poetry? Tell poetry." Finnegas said, "Sit down here." And they just started to have a conversation when up from the waters came the salmon, and it landed in Finn McCool's lap, wriggled like a baby. "I've been waiting years for this," said Finnegas. "Right, lad, you can cook this fish for me. I need some time to go and think. Very soon I will be the wisest in the world." He went off to the woods and left Finn McCool to cook that fish, with strict instructions that Finn must not eat any of the flesh of the fish. He turned the spit and roasted it, but as he was doing it, a great blister appeared on the skin of the fish, and Finn McCool, in turning that spit, burnt his thumb as the blister burst, and he put his thumb in his mouth without thinking and tasted some of the flesh. When Finnegas returned, he said, "You look different. Have you eaten any of that fish?" "No," said Finn McCool, truthfully, "although," he said, "I did burn my thumb. There was a blister on the skin of the fish, and I've been waiting for 7 years, said Finnegas, "for this fish. But clearly you were the one that really should have eaten it. Finish it off," he said. Finn McCool had presented it on a maple wooden plate, and it steamed, and he ate every morsel. and acquired that wisdom. So from that day on, Finn McCool only had to bite on his thumb, and he could tell the future. He knew what to do. Dad, just tell us one more story. Grandma, say that one again. A mighty king, Nuha, fought in a battle and lost his arm. He's imperfect, the people said. We cannot have an imperfect king. We need someone better. And they looked around and they chose a very charming man called Bress. He promised a lot, Bress, and he looked good. He had a unique way of expressing himself, but he became the new king. As soon as Bress became king, he introduced two things. One was tax, the other was work. Except not for everyone, not in the same way. You see, for the Fomorians, the privileged, the work that they were given was to be the slave masters, and they knew all the tax loopholes. As for the Tuatha De Danann, they had to work like slaves. And they were taxed so heavily, they were scared to breathe in case their breath was taxed. Now, it was tradition that when there was a new king, the storyteller of Ireland, the greatest storyteller, who was Carv, would come and tell the king stories and entertain him. Carv made his way to the castle. A guard welcomed him in and said, it's a little tricky, a little difficult. The king seems to have forgotten that you were coming. He was put in a cold stone room with no fire. And that evening, instead of the banquet he expected, he was given 3 dry cakes of bread and water. Well, I don't know about you. If someone mistreats me like that, I'm not very happy, particularly as a storyteller. And Cav was fuming. He sat there all night, not sleeping, with his stomach churning with anger. And he kept thinking of all the witty and wise things he'd like to say to the king if he saw him. By the morning, the king still hadn't arrived, and Cav left that place. He went out to the people, and as soon as he opened his mouth, all of the churning anger which had risen up in the night, and all the wise, witty words that slid down into the back of his throat met. And Cav began to talk, and when he talked, what he talked was satire, the very first satire, humour. When he described the king satirically, the people laughed. And that was the beginning of the end for that leader. The stories that my family told me, I really wanted to share with you. And I'd like to finish with a final story. which you can tell again. It's a little fairy story. It's a favourite of mine. There was a brother and sister. Their parents had died, left them a little croft cottage. But you see, the sister believed that Archie, her brother, had been loved more by their parents than she was, and so she treated him abominably, always getting at him. Archie, she'd say, this chair leg needs mending. Archie, get up on the roof, there's a hole there. Archie, do this, do that. Archie, Archie, Archie. He was delighted one day, 1st of May, to go out with the dogs and just take in the sunshine, watch the sun shadows across the hills, walk along those green fields. And after a long time of walking, he sat down on a stone, wanting to eat his little pack of sandwiches and his little bottle of milk. But as he was sitting there, just about to drink from his milk bottle, he saw a little man standing by his feet. The little man was wearing a crown. "Oi," said the little man. "What are you doing here? We're having a party here today. Shift yourself." For some reason, even though Archie had been got at by his sister and put up with it for many years, in this instance, he stood up for himself. He said, "I am having my sandwiches here, and I'm not shifting." "Well, you'll have to," said the little man. "We're having a party here, and I am the king of the fairies. Now go." "No," said Archie, and they began to have an argument. "I tell you what," said the king of the fairies, "seeing as you're a little bit obstinate, let me suggest this to you. Can you play a musical instrument?" "Can't play the fiddle, can't play the baran," said Archie. "Can you sing?" said the king of the fairies. "I've never tried, but I'll have a go," said Archie. "No," said the king of the fairies. "No, you can't sing. No, please stop." "Oh, wait," said Archie. "I can diddle." "You can diddle," said the king of the fairies. "I can diddle." Dum-dee-diddle, 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 diddle. Dum-dee-diddle, 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 diddle. Diddly-dum, diddly-dee, dum-dee-diddle-dee. Dum-dee-diddle, dum-dee-diddle, dum-dee-diddle-dee. And as he looked down, all the fairies had come out and were swinging each other around, dancing. "You can stay," said the king of the fairies. "You can stay." So Archie stayed there all day. And you know, one of the little fairies kept bringing him a little barrel about that big, crawling up him, and he'd flick the top open and drink it. It was hot and fiery. It went down well, and Archie was diddling like a good un. But that beautiful sunny day turned into a dark night, and the king of the fairies said, "Archie, I think your sister'll be wondering where you are. It's dark now. The dogs went home hours ago. I think you need to set off." "Do I have to?" said Archie. "I think you do," said the king of the fairies. So Archie, heavy-hearted, said goodbye, walked back across those dark, dark fields until he saw the silhouette of his sister in the doorway. He heard her voice before he saw her face. "Archie, where have you been? The dogs came home hours ago and your supper's ruined. And that chair leg still isn't mended. And the tile on the roof." And on she went. But you know, Archie just walked past her. He walked past her, he walked up the stairs. He went into his room and she followed him. "What are you doing?" she said. "Where have you been?" Archie just started folding away all his belongings. He turned to her and he said, "If you must know, I've been away with the fairies." "Oh, I knew someone was having a bad influence on you," said his sister. "Well, that's where I'm going now," he said. "Oh, no, you're not," said his sister. But Archie paid no attention to her. He just got all his stuff ready. He walked past her. He walked down the stairs. No matter how many times she said, "Archie, Archie, Archie," and out he went into the darkness under the glittering night, until he saw those little fairy lanterns at the spot where he'd been a-diddling. And there was the king of the fairies. Archie saw the king's crown glint in the moonlight. "Hey, what you doing back here?" said the king of the fairies. "Well," said Archie, "I've had enough of being human. I want to come and live with you." "Really?" said the king of the fairies. "Well, you know, you are a good diddler, and we could do with a good diddler from time to time, so we'd love for you to come over to us, but there's a problem. You are rather big. If you are willing to forego your height, you can come and live with us." And so the king of the fairies cast a spell. Archie had reduced in height. Now he was the same size as all of the other fairies. And that was the last time that Archie was seen by human beings on that day by his sister. But you know what? If anyone ever says to you, "Hey, you're away with the fairies," you can tell them, "Archie says it's a really nice place to be." Well, thank you for listening, everybody. It's been an absolute pleasure. I want to say goodbye to you. May the road rise to meet you. May the wind be always at your back, the sun shine warm upon your face, the rain fall gently on your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Now, if you'd like to put some money in the hat, that would be great. Thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you again. Keep telling the stories. From Maria. Goodbye.